Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Today, I have a special guest on. Her name is Babita Spinelli, and she's a licensed psychotherapist based out of New York. And Babita specializes in working with female adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And more specifically, she specializes in working with females that come from diverse backgrounds and cultures. So she specializes in working with that and also learning how to help you have a positive sexual self-image in your relationship. So she also does couples work and training using the Gottman method, which is very popular. And on today's show, she's going to be talking about just that. Sexual trauma in folks who come from a diverse background or diverse ethnicities, and why culture is so important when we're looking at sexual assault or sexual trauma. Why does that even matter? Why isn't it sexual trauma just sexual trauma? And how we might work with folks a little bit differently based upon their background and what how our culture and sometimes ethnicity plays a role in how sexual assault is viewed and treated in our community. And I think that's really important because, I'd like to include the cultural concepts and get us thinking outside of the box. A lot of times when we start talking about abuse and violence, we focus on those stereotypes or those statistics and things like that. And I'd like for us to, if we can, start thinking about people as people, no one size fits all, and how our culture can definitely shape how we view things, how our family view things, whether or not we're going to get help for it, and how we can recover from the trauma that we experience. And I think we have a very good discussion about that today, and she brought up some very good points and things that I hadn't thought of. Hi, Babita. It's so nice to have you on. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Hi, Nat. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Welcome. And I'm so glad that you decided to come on. You have several unique niches. Can you tell my listeners a little bit about you and what you do and the types of folks that you work with?
Sure, of course. So I'm a psychotherapist in private practice. I'm also psychoanalytically trained and trained in EMDR. So I work with individuals, adults, couples, and teens. And my niches are, I have a diverse practice. I work in the multicultural space. I also work in the space of trauma. And I work predominantly with women, but that's not to say that I do not have men in my practice. And I also work in the space of blended families.
Okay. And for people who don't know, can you explain a little bit about what psychodynamic means and what EMDR is?
Sure, of course. So psychodynamic psychotherapy is predominantly a form of talk therapy, but that doesn't mean that you don't bring in other modalities like any sort of techniques around behaviors, DBT, CBT, but generally it is psychodynamically oriented. You sort of have this dialogue between yourself and the client in this interpersonal space. And sort of the work is through that therapeutic alliance, that journey. EMDR is used predominantly in the space of trauma, but we are moving it into other areas like anxiety or depression,
Okay.
etc. And it is called eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it is basically reprocessing, let's say if we're working in trauma, certain traumatic images or experiences within the brain so that you're able to process them and they're not as powerful as they have been living within yourself. And so that you learn to sort of be able to cope with that traumatic experience.
Okay. What
That's
type?
sort of a snapshot.
It is. And I like EMDR, and I'm curious if you could tell folks what types of traumas EMDR has been successful for.
Sure. One is the trauma of adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse is one. Another one could be any sort of trauma around being, let's say one was in a narcissistic abusive relationship. There could be any kind of trauma around if someone went to combat. That's sort of, it's been used for Vietnam vets. We have any trauma, let's say you were in some sort of traumatic experience such as Hurricane Sandy. So there's a lot of different traumas that you could use for EMDR.
Okay, sounds good. And it sounds like it could help a lot of people out. Is there maybe any types of traumas that it's not recommended for, or that it hasn't been as successful in treating? Do you know that?
I think it really all depends on the individual. And so there are certain experiences where if there is an extensive amount of trauma and the individual, let's say, doesn't have the appropriate resourcing, so that it's hard for them to find the stabilization after the processing, then we wouldn't necessarily always recommend it for that person. So for example, if someone is a survivor of abuse or survivor of sexual abuse, but they don't really have the resourcing after that sort of processing of EMDR is done, I would not necessarily use that in those situations.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about what drives the passion behind what you do.
Oh, well, for me, really, it's about the fact that I feel honored that I'm able to work in a partnership with individuals who give me a glimpse of their stories, of their worlds, and that they sort of trust in our therapeutic relationship to help move them forward, to make a difference in their lives. They want to make particular changes. They want to heal. They want to overcome certain things that have happened in their life. And so my passion is actually from them, is that I have the honor to work with them. I love doing that. And I love being able to see how they move forward in their life in a healthier and happier way.
Okay. Yeah, and that's amazing. Any personal connections you have with the work in terms of like anything that you really identify with in your clients?
Well, I think around trauma, yes, I do. I think that part I really resonate with my clients. I've also had very particular impactful life transitions and gone through certain phases around that. And I think so I take from that personal experience, also acknowledging that everybody has their own unique experience, but that sort of helps to drive me and be able to understand their subjectivity.
Great. And and I'm happy that you said that, because a lot of people feel like as therapists, we're just kind of, up here, kind of on the outside looking in, and maybe can't really identify with what they're going through sometimes. And it's good to hear that you can connect with your clients on a much deeper level, and that you're speaking from the heart, you're speaking from experience, and that it's not just something and not to say that if you just have education and training, that you can't work with people, but I think people connect more with someone who has gone through certain things.
Yes, it's so true, Nat. And I think also when you are a culturally sensitive therapist too, that identification is also helpful, even if you might not be from the same culture. If you're working in a space where you feel like you can understand the sensitivity around culture and be able to sort of see how that comes into the therapy, that's also very significant also.
And when you say cultural sensitivity, I'd like for you to explain to the listeners what exactly does that mean and why is cultural sensitivity important?
Mhm. Well, I think what that means really is that the therapist has really been deeply trained in an understanding that people come from various cultures and backgrounds, and those cultures and backgrounds have specific experiences that have impacted or continue to impact that individual, and that it makes a difference in the work in terms of bringing
Mhm.
that sort of identification that they have in. The other part is that what it means is that when you're kind of going through that journey with a client, um, you are not only working in a space of particular clinical techniques, but you're
Mhm.
also working in a space where you are making room and understanding that their experience has been impacted by their background, by where their roots, basically.
Right, right. And I feel like that's very important. And almost like, it's like accepting the fact that people are different. And because they're different, their needs are different, and
Yes.
yeah, even though we may share similar experiences, how those things are expressed and treated can be very different. It's not a one size fits all, essentially.
Yes, exactly. That was
Yes.
perfectly said.
Yes, and so you're here today, although we've kind of talked a little bit more about your specialties, but you're here today to talk about adult childhood survivors of sexual abuse, which is who you work with, right? You work with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Am I saying that right?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Um, And I know this may sound a little silly to you and maybe to some of the listeners, but can you talk a little bit about what is sexual abuse? Because I feel like sometimes people may say, uh, they may minimize or they may dismiss it because maybe it's a one-time thing, maybe it happened by a family member, or maybe, they may dismiss certain elements of it. But can you talk a little bit about what that is so our listeners can really get a deeper understanding of that?
Sure. So, sexual abuse is any form of undesired, unconsensual, forced sexual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it is manipulative and it is coerced.
Right. And
And so
typically, yeah.
sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
and it's often called, molestation. So it's any form of sexual touching at all.
Okay. So, and can you be a little bit more specific about sexual touching? Like in terms of what that would be, where that would be, for
Mhm.
people who may not know.
Sure. I mean, it could be in any part of the body where someone would feel that it is unwanted, it is forced. Any intimate part of the body, upper part of the body, the behind. I mean, anything where someone would feel like they are being violated.
Mm-hmm.
And usually there is some frequency in terms of when we call it sexual abuse. There is something
Mm-hmm.
that's not to say that it's, even if it's a one-time thing, it's still sexual abuse. But when we look at the overall survivor concept, it's usually that there's a bit of duration to it.
Okay. And why would something such as sexual abuse be important to look at from a multicultural perspective? I know you answered it, a little bit in your last question, but I want to talk about this topic specifically because I know a lot of people out there listening are going to say, you know what, abuse is abuse is abuse.
Yes, and I think this is where the education around the
Mm-hmm.
cultural part comes in. And so I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to give some specific examples. I mean, there's so much on this, but I'll just give you some key ones to share why culture and background makes a difference. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with the premise that yes, there are certain powerful themes that come up as a result of the impact for a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. We have shame, we have guilt, we have anger, we have blame, self-blame. When it comes to culture, their particular cultures have a certain way of being that impacts how the child and then the survivor has experienced the abuse. For example, there are particular cultures that are known as the collectivist culture.
Mhm.
That culture, basically, it's all about the tribe. It's about the village. It's about the group. It's that sense of community. It's almost as if it takes a village to raise a child. So
Yeah.
those cultures where there's extended family involved, where kids are being raised by uncles, aunts, grandparents, and everybody's coming together, you know, it's a beautiful thing. And yet, when there is abuse in those kinds of cultures, oftentimes, and very sadly so, the tribe comes before the victim.
Okay.
And so the what's happened to the child or the victim is denied or may not be received because it's usually a close member within the tribe that's actually committed the abuse.
And when you say the tribe comes before the victim, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Like when they put the
Sure.
tribe before the victim?
Yes. So for example, so we're talking about a survivor who's a child. So let's say at the time, the child says this, you know, this is what's been happening to me, to a parent or to a family member. And there's a denial, there's a rejection of that, saying, oh no, so-and-so wouldn't do it. Or there's a feeling of, how are we going to even bring this up into the family or into this tribe? They have been taking care of us, or that we are all part of this one unit. It will bring a lot of shame or blame. And so the denial of that child, and then ultimately, if a survivor goes back and says, look, this is what happened to me, same concept. So that is one example of what happens in terms of certain cultures. Another one is, for example, when you have a culture where there is a male dominating, the male is the dominant gender. And that it's almost as if there's this accepted norm of submission that's taking place and there's no voice. And perhaps it comes from a culture of oppression. And so what ends up happening is, again, the victim almost is not quite understand or is confused around what happened and whether it's actually okay to speak. And when they do speak, there's a lot of shame that comes up. There's a denial. Their experience is not heard, witnessed, seen. And so they end up sort of living in that space of not feeling like they can say anything because of the fact of this culture that they've come from.
And you know, just to, you know, bring it home for our listeners, would that be something such as like maybe a law enforcement culture, or maybe perhaps a military culture, or perhaps even U.S. culture, where people a lot of times say like it's a man's world?
I mean,
And that a man is just being a man, and things like that, when, oh, you shouldn't have, you know, a woman shouldn't dress provocatively to tease a man, or, you know, is that the kind of things that you're referring to in that sort of
I mean,
circumstance?
it could definitely be those circumstances too, and that's very powerful. It can also be cultures that are even beyond the U.S. that have that. So yes, but it could definitely also be within a U.S. culture, also depending on what that community is like as far as the dominance of the male. What also comes up in particular cultures is if there's intergenerational abuse that's accepted, right? So now you have this cycle that this has been transmitted from generation to generation, and it's accepted, and there isn't a break in this cycle. So the victim, it's like maybe mom was abused, or dad, maybe grandpa, grandfather, grandmother. Then the victim is also then a victim who doesn't feel like they can say anything because generationally no one spoke up.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. When you have generational trauma or intergenerational trauma, or any of these really, do you feel like any one of these are harder to treat or work with as opposed to the other?
No, I think each individual that I work with is,
Yeah.
I think, you know, equally hard
Yeah.
in different ways, because they
Okay.
all have their unique set of circumstances. But what is, I think, when it becomes, if I were to say when it becomes difficult, is if they come from a background where there is so much shame and not acceptance or non-education
Yeah.
of the fact that this exists,
Yeah.
it becomes harder because there's a lot of dissociation on the part of the victim.
Yeah.
And so even though they've stepped up to seek help, or let's say they've come to me for a whole other set of issues, they're going through a life transition, and through the therapy, I start to see the red flags and say, I wonder if something has happened. They had so much dissociation, it becomes difficult to finally get to the place where they feel safe enough to be able to say, yes, this has happened to me.
Interesting. Yeah. Then me just being on the outside looking in, I've always thought that, and maybe this is my own personal bias, but intergenerational trauma would be different because of the cyclical reoccurrence and the long line of just, maybe like heredity or family factors, that dynamics and things like that kind of come into play, and how it would be difficult to not only deal with the trauma, but to perhaps step outside and do something different than what your predecessor or ancestors have done.
Yes, actually, that is very true. And I think as you're looking at it from that aerial view, and I'm sort of in the weeds saying, oh, it's all, it's all there and it's all hard. But yes, absolutely not. You're right.
Okay.
It is harder to break the cycle, and it is harder than to go out there and feel like you have a voice to speak up. And this is like systemic.
Yes. And, too, as you're talking about the different types of sexual abuse, or, the different scenarios in which it falls into play, what comes up for me is the struggles of a person of color versus a non-person of color. And, differences that they may have in each one of these scenarios. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think in terms of a person of color, we go back to that concept of the collectivist culture. So you're kind of being raised by the village concept. There's a lot of tight knit family, a sense of family, and very hard to be able to speak up. You also have, from a person of color, maybe a sense of like, I have to keep going. I have to keep positive. I have to, this isn't as important. Fear of saying anything because feeling like maybe I won't be heard. Everybody has their trials and tribulations. Okay. Sometimes even not even recognizing that it's abuse.
Okay. Fair enough. And then, for me, as I'm listening to you, what are some of the signs and symptoms of someone who is an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse? Are there any sort of signs and symptoms that are common or that can be parsed out from someone who's experienced this?
I mean, I think there's many. So maybe we could look at first some of the signs and symptoms that may come up in a relationship if you've been a victim. So there is often what happens is a fear of emotional intimacy versus sex. And there's like a splitting, right? It's hard to integrate. So here's sex and here's emotional intimacy, and kind of bringing it together ends up being difficult. We have the inability perhaps to completely experience full pleasure, like really fully embrace sexual pleasure in the relationship. There's a lot of secrecy that often comes up within relationships for people who've been victims, because when you've been a childhood survivor of sexual abuse, it tends to be a secret, right? Don't say anything to anyone. And so what ends up happening is that that way of being then comes into your relationships. You tend to keep secrets, or there's secrets, generally like a lack of transparency. And a lot of that is just because of what's happened. Promiscuity or infidelity, that tends to come up within this realm for individuals who are survivors. And again, I say all of this not to say that it's so cookie cutter that every single person that this comes up in their relationships. But these are some of them And then actually I didn't name body image and self-esteem within the relation, not feeling good enough, feeling like they're at fault for something, whatever that may be.
And I want to take it back for a second. When you say that someone is not able to experience pleasure, can you talk about a little bit more in detail about what that looks like?
Sure. I mean, so full pleasure, meaning they might be able to go and have sex, but to allow themselves to let go and feel they deserve it, that there isn't any reminder of the pain they might have experienced or the shame they might have experienced. So to be able to feel like they deserve to have the pleasure, they deserve to orgasm, it's okay, there's nothing wrong with it. And a lot of times that's just in the unconscious, that there could be a certain amount of pleasure, but it may not be going to the extent that they can embrace. Or they need to perhaps go into some sort of fantasy space, maybe not truly being able to connect to the person that they're with, because perhaps they haven't processed all of the things that they need to around what happened to them in terms of the abuse.
Okay. Any sort of, and that makes a lot of sense. I'm also wondering too about emotional signs and symptoms that someone who's been sexually abused may go through.
Yeah, so there's depression, and also not knowing where it's coming from. I have anxiety, again, not knowing where it's coming from. If they haven't, gotten some of the help that's needed. And so there's extensive shame, extensive not feeling good enough. So all of these emotions, a fear of abandonment, because let's say they were never protected, right? No one came to my rescue, and it's going to happen again. I'm going to be left. I'm not going to be protected. Fear, so being in a fearful place. The inability sometimes to cope with certain like day-to-day things because of the abuse. So there's a lot of those sorts of symptoms or things that come up.
Now, I've worked with a lot of survivors of sexual abuse, and for our listeners, especially if they've gone through it, a lot of times people, when they come to me, they say, this is something that happened in my past. I want to forget about it and move on. I don't really want to dwell on that. I don't really want to, they may not even necessarily want to talk about it in therapy, and they want to say that this is a thing of the past. Tell me, what do you say to that, and how do you work with someone like that who really doesn't want to even delve into it, or refuses to maybe acknowledge that this is something that could be impacting them now?
Now, that's a great question, and that comes up for me too, especially if someone's coming in for something else and then it's revealed. And I always say, first I always work in a place of deep empathy. I say, I understand and I hear you. I know that you want to put this behind you and keep it in the past. This is extremely painful, and I get it. I'm with you. But if we don't process it, this is not witnessed in here, if you do not speak to it, if you are not seen, this will continue to come up in different ways that maybe you won't even realize, but it will create obstacles for you. And then I would sort of share how these things can show up. And sometimes it's an aha moment, like, oh my God, or I might say, remember when you were talking about this? Have you ever thought about that perhaps this might be connected to what took place in your abuse? Why don't we go there?
Okay.
And that's sort of how I sort of transition it in. Of course, with a lot of patience, that it takes time, and eventually the person ends up becoming comfortable with saying, I see it now, and this is why we need to do this. And again, eventually you can move into that positive space. It doesn't define you. It is not your story, but you're going to create this new narrative by being able to process that, heal from it, and be able to learn from it and move on, and perhaps be able to share that in a way that it can make some changes if you want within your own world.
Yeah, I like that, and that's often I try to tie it back in too. Of course, I may not necessarily, press somebody, but I always tie it back into them, and I leave it up to them about, whether or not they want to go forward, because things affect people differently. And with that being said, I want to visit like somatic, the somatic pieces of the sexual trauma, because I feel like that's an important piece. And I know we've kind of talked about the emotional stuff, but I do think that, whenever someone's been sexually abused, the body keeps the score, right?
Oh, yes.
And
Oh,
so
yes.
I'm curious if you can talk about that, maybe some of the somatic experiences that people who've been sexually abused, and what a somatic experience would be.
Oh, yes. Nat, yeah, exactly. So some of the somatic experiencing, I've worked with individuals who've had a lot of GI issues, right? A lot of intestinal GI issues. They're containing it within their stomachs. They've held on to the secret. They've held on to the pain. There's no release, and it's coming up in that way. Also somatically coming up in back pain. That's been, I've had clients coming in with that. It's all in the back. It's all in the back. They cannot move. They don't feel supported. They have not been supported, right? Their story has not been heard. They were never protected. And, the back is sort of like the structure. So somatically, it coming out there. Somatically coming out in migraines. Right? Somatically coming out in private parts, of the body as well. So somatic experiencing in that. I mean, those are some of the things that in terms of what I've worked with as far as where it shows up in the body.
Yeah, and people, when they're being touched or in a certain way, or even being sexually intimate, sort of tensing up, right? Or
Yes.
tensing up or trying to check out. Either they're, emotionally dissociating, or they've taken some sort of mood altering substance that can make them sort of check all the way out, so that this is like a blur. Maybe they won't even remember.
Exactly. Yes. So the tensing of the body, the inability to really relax, the sort of kind of, the gesture, the like not being able to like take it in, the protection. So the body is like manifesting what's going on within their emotions and unable to release.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. And what are some ways, well, let's talk about unhealthy versus healthy ways of coping with being an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse. What are some unhealthy ways that people try to either cope on their own or self-medicate on their own, things that they are doing that they may not necessarily know that they are doing? It's unhealthy.
So unhealthy is alcohol abuse, being self-abusive to themselves by excessive drinking, drugs to numb the pain, so opioids, any other form of drugs to sort of numb themselves. In addition, other unhealthy ways is let's say there's unhealthy eating, right? Like bulimia, sometimes sort of like, eating, but like throwing it up. So anything around eating disorders are also ways that people end up sort of, it's interesting because it is a coping mechanism when it comes to survivors. So those things come up. Other unhealthy ways, I would go back to the whole promiscuity, because it's a way of sort of disconnecting from intimacy. And that's actually come up in the work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's that. Yeah. So I think those are some of the ways in terms of unhealthy coping, or just, dissociation, although with dissociation, there's not even an awareness that they're dissociating.
Right.
Anger, they're unleashing anger. They're not even sure why. and it's coming out on their, let's say, their relationship and their
Mhm.
kids, etc. That's also an unhealthy way of coping, extreme anger.
Sure. Okay. And what about healthy ways of, well, before we even take it there, if I'm a person and I'm sexually abused, however, I may not necessarily be aware that I've been sexually abused, or perhaps I am aware and I'm just one of those people that kind of has been doing everything to forget about it and not bring it up and not address it. How can I then develop some sort of insight that that's what I'm doing? Like how does that awareness sort of develop into that to have a healthier understanding of what's going on with me and what's causing me to react this way?
Hmm. I mean, I think that from my perspective, if there is a recognition that this is happening,
Mm-hmm.
I would say a better understanding happens if you actually see a therapist, if you
Mm-hmm.
join a support group, if you start to read. There's some amazing books like The Courage to Heal, The Body Keeps the Score, and I think that provides a better understanding of
Mm-hmm.
what's taking place, and those are the suggestions that I would make for any individual that is sort of has some insight and saying, okay, I'm sort of noticing something here.
Okay.
Ask for help, get the support to help you with this.
Okay. Fair enough. And what, I know you just named some, but do you have any other ways of healthy coping that people can do, on their own, maybe even?
Hmm. I would recommend, for me, I think mindfulness is really significant. Meditation, sort of breathing to lessen any sort of anxiety. I would recommend being able to talk about it where they feel safe to talk about it. Understanding boundaries is really important, so that they know that they have a voice, that they can feel empowered, and to set those boundaries. It could be in a work environment, in a personal environment. It's very important to be able to be aware that they can do that
Mm-hmm.
in terms of coping. And get as much support as they can. But I think those are some of the things that and there's a huge amount, but that's just some to be
Okay.
able to cope.
Okay. And when we say something like mindfulness, can you let our listeners know exactly what mindfulness is and how we can sort of practice that on our own?
Sure. I think mindfulness is from my perspective, I think this might be a bit of the beta definition based on all sorts of things, but it's really being present within yourself to connect
Mm-hmm.
with what are you feeling, what's going on in my body, what's going on emotionally, and in that space also being very self-compassionate towards yourself. And that can also project out, to others. But as we talk about coping, to say, okay, I deeply love and accept myself. What's taking place here? Let me get in touch with that. What might be going on with me? Let me be in touch and attune with that. What do I need for myself? How do I meet my needs right now? And
Mm-hmm.
answering those questions and meeting those needs, and because those needs weren't met, those needs weren't met by that child, right?
Mm.
So as a survivor, so significant.
Okay, yeah, and that is significant. And I have to agree with you. I love mindfulness-based practice. Um, One of the things I do want to ask you about, because I feel like this comes up a lot too with some of the people that I work with, is what if their abuser is still very much a part of their life?
Mm.
Um, and perhaps maybe they even want them to be. I'm not, you have people that sometimes don't want them to be, but maybe they feel like there's some sort of obligation, like that's my parent or that's my blood relative. I may feel like I don't have a choice. Like for example, like when you were talking about how it's a village, or,
Yes.
things like that where they may feel like they can't avoid that person, or that person has to be a part of their circle, or they have to deal with them on some level. Um,
Yeah, that's a good
what do you,
question.
yeah, what do you say to that? How do you work with them?
That no, excellent question. And yes, that does come up, and it comes up often. So a
Mm-hmm.
few things. I think the first is probably one. There has to be cultural sensitivity around that, but some psychoeducation. And what I mean by that is this person still a danger to yourself or to those around you, or if you have children, and so that's important, right? And that maybe this individual, although they feel like they still need to be around this person, may not understand whether or not this person might be a danger to themselves or anybody else
Mm-hmm.
that's in their life. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to do some education around that and
Mm-hmm.
find out about that, and then say, what would it be like to set those boundaries? Can you imagine doing that? And I think that takes a lot of processing and understanding. The other part is, let's say that person is not a danger, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and my client wants to move into a place of forgiveness. We would then talk about how that would show up. What would it mean to feel like they've still had their voice, they still feel like they've been witnessed and heard, but they feel like they can move into a place of forgiveness because they don't want to have that toxicity within themselves or in their environment or in their experiences. So we would perhaps go in that direction and process that. So everybody has their own healing, but I think what is important is to be able to say what is going to be healthy for you and what is healthy for anyone who's around you, should this person still be part of your tribe,
Mm-hmm.
and take
Okay.
it from there.
And then two, or would you recommend the same thing for a person who, again, is an adult survivor of childhood abuse, and maybe the abuser per se is not a part of their life, but perhaps another person who was there and witnessed it and didn't do anything. And the thing that comes from me is like a parent who was privy to their child being abused and molested, and they didn't do anything to stop it. Is
Yes,
that similar?
yes, I mean, it gets so complicated,
It
right?
does.
And I think there is, again, the sensitivity of what does that mean to this particular individual as we go through their
Mm-hmm.
healing, in terms of speaking up at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, of course, in an ideal situation, we want to be able to say, to be able to feel heard and seen and witnessed, and to be able to say, look,
Mm-hmm.
this is what happened to me, and I need
Mm-hmm.
you to own the fact that you didn't protect me. I want to talk
Mm-hmm.
about this with you, with the parent. If there's a certain set of circumstances where they feel they can't do that, for example, if that person is, let's say, very ill, they're very elderly, or whatever that reason is, and they don't want to go there now, then I think it's a matter of, how do you end up working through with the therapist, let's say with me,
Mm-hmm.
in feeling like you're still heard and witnessed, feeling like you've sort of been able to say what you need to, and
Mm-hmm.
recognize that this situation still exists.
Okay.
And so that's sort of another approach to that. I think there's a lot of ideal situations that we
Mm-hmm.
would like, from my
Yeah.
perspective as a therapist, to be able to say, set the boundary, do not have this person in your life, you need to speak up. But I
Yeah.
think we also just have to be mindful of the circumstances. But my
Mm-hmm.
biggest thing is anyone else in danger,
Yeah. Yeah, you bring up an excellent point there too, and I want to touch on it before we run out of time, perhaps a little bit quickly. Uh, let's say there is someone else in danger from this person. As therapists, you and I, we have legal obligations and things like that. But those people who are aware of it don't. What do you do with someone who may be aware that a child is being abused now or is at risk for being abused? How do you work with that?
I would start going back to sort of some education around it and saying,
Mm-hmm.
this will continue. You were a victim. someone else could be a victim. This will perpetuate and continue the cycle. It is our obligation and duty and yours to be able to go back and stop this from happening, right? Otherwise, this will continue on and we will have victim after victim. And when we don't speak up, when we don't stop it, we continue to have children being abused, and then we have adult survivors. So we need to educate. We need to go out into community and educate. And I think through our work, we can do that. And that's the way to be able to sort of, I think, reach out to someone.
Right. Plus, go by whatever the legal mandate for reporting.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because we're almost out of time. Gosh, I felt like it went so fast.
It did. It's so much there, right? So much to share, and that we want to share with everybody about this.
It is so much there. What are some resources that you can suggest for people who are adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse?
I mean, first and foremost, I would suggest if you can go and literally, see a therapist, someone who specializes in trauma, has a specialty area. It doesn't have to be the only specialty area, but around survivors of sexual abuse. Also, there's many support groups out there, depending on what state you live in, that offer support for survivors in hospitals, in community centers. So you could reach out there. Even actually, there's a lot of private practitioners that offer groups around that as resources. There's also actually police stations that run groups actually in New York around victims of survivors of trauma. And then I would say you can also, there's so much out there as far as what you could read that can be helpful. Again, The Courage to Heal, It's Not My Fault. There's several really wonderful books for someone who wants to take that time and read them. There are a lot of resources out there.
Yeah, and I think I like, for me, I like rainn.org, RAINN.org. I think is a really good website that has a lot of really good books and resources and things where you can find in your community. I'll be sure to post that in the show notes. Babita, how can people contact you if they want to talk to you, get to know you, or follow you, or what have you?
Sure. So my website and the name of my practice is Opening the Doors Psychotherapy, so openingthedoorspsychotherapy.com. They can also reach me, reach out and call me. I always have my door open, and 347-884-7316. Also, I'm on Facebook, as well as Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest. So a lot of ways to reach out to me, and I welcome that. I welcome anyone reaching out, even if they just want to have a consult or a call, to just say, I saw you, speaking to Nat. I'd like to learn more. I have some questions. Can you give me, any guidance?
Yeah. Sounds great. Well, you've been such a pleasure to have on the show. I appreciate
thank you.
About this.
Been a pleasure to be here. It's a sensitive topic that's very near and dear to me, and I'm glad we could talk about it in this forum.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nat. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so you heard Miss Spinelli, and I think she brought up some very good points in this show in terms of diversity and culture and how we work with sexual assault victims, survivors of childhood sexual assault. Tongue-tied there. That kind of happens on the show a lot. And I have a fantastic editor who you guys, he does a great job, and you guys don't even get to see or hear half the stuff that I flub over. Anyhow, So, love to hear what you thought about the show. If you have any suggestions or if you want to reach out to me, please do at datewithdarkness@gmail.com. And I hope that you guys take care and have a great rest of your week. And until next time, thank you so much for listening and be well.